Hey, this is Good Faith Dialogue. I hope you're well. Today's episode concerns the problem of evil. In other words, a response to the question of how God and evil can be said to coexist. To begin with a couple disclaimers. One, I'm going to assume at the outset that there is such thing as moral good and evil, since that's what the objection presumes. In other words, if there's evil, then if there's objective evil, then an objective good, God can't exist. The precise nature and more specific things about moral good and evil and morality and where that comes from and can be justified will be addressed in a future video. And also, I will assume the law of non-contradiction. Just, a thing can't both be and not be in the same respect at the same time. And of course, I can't meet all the objections to that in one video in terms of, maybe Schrodinger's cat and quantum physics would seem to cast doubt on that. I would say that those objections can be responded to, and I'd plan to address that whole aspect of the discussion in a future video. And I know the problem of evil is a very personal one for you and for me, and so this isn't a response to or a rationalization of or trying to explain away any particular suffering anybody has undergone, you or me. So the goal is not, okay, well, this thing happened to this person and it's just actually it's not that bad, or there's this great fantastic good that makes it that's not the tone that I intend whatsoever, because I think that's just a callous and ugly response to the question. So this whole discussion is simply a response to the what may be called the logical problem of evil, and just kind of the general character of it, which is encapsulated in the following quote by Charles Bray in The Philosophy of Necessity. And he kind of got this idea from a quote that's commonly attributed to Epicurus. And so here it is. Would God be willing to prevent evil, but he's unable? Therefore, he is not omnipotent. Would he be capable, but without desire? So he's malevolent. Would he be both capable and willing? If so, then why is there evil? That's a reasonable question, I think. And so to address the question, any person discussing an objection with another, in order to make progress on the question, both need to have a shared understanding of what they mean by the words. And so we need to have a shared understanding of what evil is, what the nature of evil is, what we're talking about when we say something's evil. And also, we need to have a shared understanding of how good and evil relate to causal power and ability. So in other words, what does it mean to cause evil? And so I'm going to start with what evil is and what the nature of evil is. So the question is, what exactly does evil, quote unquote, what does that term point to or refer to in reality? And so when we use the term dog, there's a dog over there. The term dog points to a particular, animal that has such and such a nature and characteristic behaviors. That thing over there, that animal over there. When we say this is yellow or that thing is yellow, we're referring to a determinate quality that this thing has, that its surface, in virtue of certain physical characteristics, it reflects certain wavelengths of light within certain conditions. And when we say that person is running, what the thing in reality that the term running refers to is the actual activity that the person is performing in reality. And so the question is, well, evil, what kind of thing is it? Where is it? What is it? And I think it's clear, even from the initial consideration, that evil is not the same kind of thing or quality as, dog, yellow, running, or whatever, in part because it's more general. It's like one of the most widest categories, so like good versus evil, and, presumably everything else can kind of fit into that within that framework, or at least that's the most general division within that kind of way of considering things. And evil, as we'll see more in the discussion, involves a lack rather than a having of something. So more on that later. But in order to even get into that, we have to get into what it means to say anything about anything at all. So we use the word is and we use the words is not. And so we don't and can't say this is something and then this is not that same something. So a thing can't both be and not be in the same respect, the same way at the same time. And so that points to something in reality. So our saying it can't both is and is not, or when we make a statement, this is something, this is not something, that those can't both be true at the same time, because in reality, the thing can't both be that thing and not that thing at the same time. And most of the time when we use the term is, we're saying that something has some feature or is something which it possibly could not have or could possibly not be. So I guess the clearest example is, this is round. Something could deform it. It has this characteristic. Something is yellow. Well, you could paint over it. Something is a dog. Well, it could be a dog, and then it'd be terrible if something came and ate the dog. The material that would be part of the dog would be part of something else. And so most of the time we're using is, we're saying something is a positively existing determinate thing. But sometimes when we use is, we're actually saying that something lacks a feature. Even though it sounds like we're saying something positive, something is, it's kind of a sneaking in an is not. So saying that something lacks a feature, which it possibly could have. And so a token example would be blindness. So if I said there's blindness in my right eye, it sounds like I'm saying something is there, like the blindness, there's something that's there that's not in my left eye. It's saying like there's something there that it gained but lacked before. So imagine, I developed a tumor and that caused me to go blind in an eye. It would sound like, well, I gained something in the right eye. But what it actually means is that I lack something that I had before. I lack the genuine power for the activity of sight. And so I'm lacking something that it had or could have by nature, because that's what the eye does. And so to introduce a category of being here, just like a general category, what I mean here is a privation is a lack or loss or deprivation. That means that something doesn't have some particular positively existing real thing or feature that it could potentially have. So my eye is characterized by my right eye is characterized by the privation of sight. So blindness is a privation from the power and the activity of functioning sight. Well, stepping back, what is a lack? Well, it's not quite something, because it's a lack of something. It's something you don't have. But it's not quite nothing either, because if I say that this thing has this lack or this thing has this privation, it tells me something real about the thing, about the reality of the thing. It tells me what it lacks. And so it's not quite something and it's not quite nothing. It implies that there is some particular thing that we're talking about which doesn't have but could have, or in other words, could be receptive to, or could receive, with enough power or time or whatever manipulation, some particular real feature. And so one might reasonably ask, well, doesn't a functioning eye lack blindness? It sounds like, well, if the blind eye lacks sight, you can say the functioning eye lacks blindness, and they're kind of both on equal footing. And I think we can say that, and everybody knows what we mean by that. But the question is, what exactly do we mean, and what exactly we're pointing to in reality, and is there a basis in reality for one being kind of more proper or appropriate than the other? And I would say so. But that begins with a consideration of, well, what is the eye? And so this isn't to give an exhaustive, precise biological definition, but what we mean by eye, we're referring to something in reality like the organ that we have that is uniquely fitted and disposed, that has the function by nature of seeing, or at least being used to see. And it's characterized by its unique suitedness for a certain activity, the activity of sight, the actual functioning of sight, and the existing operation and exercise of vision. But to say an eye is blind negates this actual existing operation. It's a negation of that. Kind of like how saying immaterial, that doesn't tell me what it is. It tells me that, whatever it is, I'm negating certain limitations and properties of it. And so I would say that it makes more sense to say that the blind eye lacks sight than the seeing eye lacks blindness, because the blindness is a lack of something that the other eye has. Well, in the example, isn't the tumor something actually existing? Yes, but I think there's a difference between saying the eye has a tumor or is tumored, if that's a word, and saying the eye is blind. So even though I may be using is or has there, one connotes what something has and then the other connotes what it doesn't have. And so that was all the wind up, and this is kind of the pitch at the beginning of this point. So privation involves potential. It involves the lack and the potential to have something. But potential and actual don't mean the same thing. I guess the clearest down to earth example, some of you may be all up into exercise and bodybuilding and all that. I'm working on it, but not quite there yet. But so the potential, I know from experience, the potential for six-pack abs is not the same thing as actually having six-pack abs. It's something that that could happen by nature, but the lack is not the same thing as having. But it's also not nothing, because I have the potential. Each of us has the potential to gain muscle in a way that a rock doesn't. Okay, why does any of that matter? How is any of that relevant? Well, it's relevant because whenever we say something is evil, or we're talking about the evil about something, we're saying that it involves some kind of privation. A clear example of, say, a cold-blooded murder. Imagine there's no justified reason for it. It's just cold-blooded murder, and that's that. So let's assume that going out. And then the question is, okay, where exactly is the evil in the situation? Well, one can ask, well, where is the weapon? Well, the weapon's right here. Where is the body? Well, you say, well, point right here. Well, then where's the evil? Well, you might say it's somehow in the whole, and I would agree with you there. But evil is not, it's like, is it in the weapon? Not really, because it's just kind of matter, whatever it is. Evil is not in the weapon, or in the air, or even in the hand of the person that did it, because the hand is just kind of living tissue that can be used for good or evil. But I think if you think about it, at the end of the day, at rock bottom, the evil is in the will or in the choice. So the will is kind of the subject or the seat or the kind of where the evil is, if it is anywhere. And so some language that we might use, and I think do use, to describe choices like that are, well, there's obviously disorder, there's dysfunction, there's imbalanced desire and motive and all that. And the reason I italicize that is because each of those is a negation. So disordering and dysfunctional and imbalanced are negations of kind of positively existing real things that we know that an action or a body or a will ought to have. And further, when we say, well, there was a lack of foresight, a lack of judgment, a lack of restraint, evil seems to involve a lack of certain features and antecedent considerations and realities that an action ought to have, and that we ought to go into it with and imbue it with and frame it in. And so I think it's worth mentioning, when we speak of, this person loved so-and-so too much, and then suppose something harmful or whatever happened, to say that there's actually no such thing as loving too much. An instance of where true harm results, that's an instance of loving too little, because there's a deficit in the right ordering and the right aim of the desire, the aim in question. And so I guess an example of the cold-blooded murder, suppose he tried to do it to right a wrong somehow, and that wasn't the legal or right way to do that. Because if he's actually, so the desire for justice is good. The desire for just the right social ordering of people, to render someone what's due to them, and to kind of be at peace in stability and right ordering of things. That is a good desire. But someone who's doing cold-blooded murder that by supposition is immoral and illegal, is circumventing the right order that circumstance invites and points to for justice. In other words, so he may be desiring justice, but he's not desiring it enough. He's not acting for it enough. He's falling short of what the actual aim would bring him to do. Well, okay, why does any of that matter? Well, in addressing the quote and the general tone of the problem of evil, we need to have a shared understanding of what evil is, and then how good and evil relate to causal power and ability. So that was a kind of brief consideration of what evil is. And now the question comes to how good and evil relate to causal power or ability. So to do this, I think it's reasonable to compare and contrast the causation of good versus causing evil. And so I think there's a fundamental difference in what's going on there. So I think that's why I'm going to try to distinguish that. So when we cause good, or we give good to a thing, someone did good to me, or did good to them, or helped them, or made something better for them, we mean that we're giving them something real and actual, or we're removing something that keeps them or the thing from doing its actual existing activities that it enacts in order to go after the goods that it's going after. And so, for example, eating food, to eat food or give food to someone who needs it, that is a good and doing good for them, because it helps us to be able to live and perform life operations. And then the driver's license, I think it's clear there that to be given a driver's license confers certain rights and privileges that enable a person to exercise their choice to pursue what they are aiming to pursue, what they're aiming to go after or drive after. So it removes impediments from them being able to do that, but it also gives them something and enables them to better go after the things that they're going after. And so here I think good can be used rightly in a sense that's just wider than, this action is good, that action is bad, because you can speak of, nutrients being good for a plant. So by good, I just mean whatever completes or gives fundamental being to something. And so then, causing evil, given what came before, evil being a lack or privation, causing an evil would seem to involve causing a lack. Well, what does it mean to cause a lack? Because it's kind of it's not something, it's not nothing. What does that mean? And so when you consider just general human action, going after something, pursuing something, acting for the sake of something, whenever we act, we do so to get at something that we deem good or good enough for some reason. Even if it's not actually good, or if it's not the best thing, or if it's not one of the best things to do in the situation, we still do it for a reason. That if say, well, why'd you do that? Even if you say, well, I don't know, you could get to the bottom of it by ultimately someone saying because, even if it's just because I wanted to do whatever I felt like doing in the moment. And some examples of reasons for action, like, to go after wealth, to go after power, to go after pleasure, to go after health, for wealth, to pursue necessary and reasonable means for survival and even a bit of comfort. Power, the ability to influence others, or at least to have some kind of security or to get some kind of job done. And then pleasure, feeling good. And then health, bodily integrity and flourishing, so that we can be freer to do other things that we're doing, or just to enjoy being healthy and in a healthy body. And so I think there's a fundamental difference between saying this is an action and this action is evil. In other words, there's a kind of different kind of category that we're doing. We're saying that. So we say when we're talking about some action as an action, we're talking about the being that it has and the something that it's going after, the something that it is. But when we say this action is evil, we're emphasizing that action, but we're emphasizing what it lacks. We're emphasizing the lack of what it should have and what it's going after. And so the action of murder, for example, somebody kills somebody else. The movement of the weapon or whatever, that is a kind of positively existing action that's taking place in the world, that involves real things doing real things. But insofar as it's evil, like the disorder or the dysfunction, the lack of whatever, insofar as it is evil, or considering it's evil, we're talking about how it falls short of going after what ought to be gone after in the situation. So if somebody murders someone for the sake of wealth, to get their money, again, the pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of means for survival and basic reasonable comfort, that is a good in itself. In other words, it's not evil. That is a good. Survival and health and security, those are goods, but the murderer is pursuing that good in a disordered way that falls short of what ought to be pursued and the way it ought to be pursued, or the multiple ways that it could alternatively been pursued in that situation. And so all that back to the quote, would God be willing to prevent evil, but he's unable, therefore he is not omnipotent? Would he be capable, but without desire, so he is malevolent? So would he be both capable and willing, so why is there evil? So that whole consideration to apply to this quote, or all those considerations apply to this quote, to address things one by one. Given that evil is a lack in something, God isn't directly causing evil in the same sense like he would sustain the universe, because evil isn't a thing in the same way as like a fish is in a bowl, because it's a lack. And so it doesn't make sense to speak of a direct cause for a lack in the same way as God would, by supposition, be directly sustaining the existence of the fish in the water. And one might object, well, if he's not causing evil, and if evil can't be caused, then it doesn't seem that we can do any evil, or that it would be false to say that. Yet, we can truly say that we do wrong because the lack is in something, namely us or our will. So we know that by experience. We experience and reflect on the reality of doing things that we know we ought not do, and we're aware of past and future responsibility, and also the good that we do. That involves the fulfillment of an aim that's pursued well and meaningfully. And so the starting point is not that there's God and then there's us and there's evil kind of third substance or whatever, this third kind of thing that's floating around that we're tapping into or we're grabbing onto, and then he's sustaining. It's just that there's God and creatures. So there's God and then there's things that are not God. And then we who are moral agents, which have authentic freedom to say yes or no to whatever choice we're confronted with, we have deficiencies in the power of choice. And so there's no contradiction in saying God exists and saying evil, quote unquote, exists, because exists don't mean the same thing there. And it's not like they're two opposites of equal power, because evil isn't a thing in itself. It's just a corruption of good that's parasitic on good and requires good in order to be, in any sense anyway. Well, if God is sustaining us in existence and we're doing the evil and he's given us the power to act, then it would seem that, well, he's kind of given us the ability to do what we're doing, and so he's directly sustaining it, and so isn't he directly responsible for our actions and their effects? And so I would say no, because we who are, individual beings, individual persons who are distinct from God, in personality, in nature, in just like we're different individuals. Uh, we have the genuine, authentic, real causal power to say yes or no to the good that is proposed to us in a choice, and also to follow through on that yes or no. And I would say there's no contradiction in this. And if you would say there is, you're welcome to, again, put your thoughts in the comments or respond to the email address listed in the description. And also, I plan to address kind of the nature and uh, quote unquote mechanics of free will in a future video, and kind of how free will fits into other considerations of God and world and good and evil. Well, then the last line of the quote, well, if all these things are true, does he have no desire to um, does he have no desire to stop the evil? And what does that mean? And I get that question from an existential level. I get that. But, or I should say, and to respond to the quote itself on the kind of verbal or logical level, I'd have to make two distinctions. One, or two clarifications. One, I would say desire as a term is imprecise in itself, because we can desire something in one sense and also not desire that same thing um, in, in another sense. And so, an example: if my kid, or if I were to have a kid, I wouldn't want my kid to get hurt, and yet, in order for them to grow up and mature and like move around the house, it must be at least possible for them to move and to bump into something that might hurt. And so I wouldn't desire that hurt, but I would desire them to be free and have bodily autonomy to do to move around at a basic level. And yes, it would be possible for them to be hurt, but the good that I am willing is not the hurt, because that's bad. I'm willing the autonomy and the ability for actual exercise of life in the house and personal life. And secondly, desire as a category or as a property or whatever doesn't exactly map onto God, because the way we think of desire and the way we experience desire, it involves bodily change. So it involves some kind of hormones, or heart beating faster or something. But God is not bodily, and he's unchangeable, as was explored in the video on the existence of God, which you're welcome to check out. And that doesn't mean that, and again, it would be misleading to say from that, well, God is cold and unfeeling and doesn't care and passionless, in the sense that he is unconcerned in any sense with the good and love and our hearts and feelings. And one way that can be known, even from just the other proof that this is the case, is that he created freely in love, since to love is to will the good of the other. So our existence and the ability to exercise freedom and life, that is a good. And so he creates and sustains us in love. And so to say that God doesn't have, quote, desire, unquote, is just to negate the limitations that would follow. So if he were kind of bound up by passions and had physical, hormones and things. And so, well, the final question, well, why would God, if he has the power and the desire, why would he permit evil? And I guess first a clarification: to say why would he permit evil is a different kind of, or to ask the question is different than saying God is unjust to permit it, because one's more open-ended and the other has, it has, or it implies a contradiction that would need to be responded to. Or in other words, to say God's unjust to permit it, to say, well, there would have to be some contradiction in God's justice and the existence of evil, which would require either a response to the other discussion or another independent argument. And I think it's also worth noting in the meanwhile, if God was unjust to permit all evil choices, or even the power to choose this or that, the power to say no to the good that we ought to do, or among the choice there. I mean, I'm not saying there's only one good thing to do necessarily in one situation, but to say no and do this lesser thing, then you and I would not exist. And meanwhile, I would say there are independent reasons for God's existence. So I'm not answering the question to say, therefore God exists. This is just a response to, well, why would he permit it? And so here is an answer, again, not responding to the particularities of individual suffering, not to explain that away. This is just a general response to the problem posed by the quote. So firstly, I would observe that human existence is good. It is good to be, and we have intrinsic worth and value, and it's good that humanity exists. And I think evidence for this, functionally at the very least, we would say, well, okay, we provide for ourselves, and we also provide for others, and we avoid things, or we try to avoid things that we know bring us harm and bring others harm. And so we're here living and working and pursuing things. And at rock bottom, we're doing so because we functionally act as if doing so is good, or at least good enough. And so, meanwhile, what makes us human is the genuine ability to know truth and then choose how we act from the place of this understanding. And love is the greatest good. So to truly act for the good of the other and to experience, all that's involved with friendship and doing good and receiving good and doing, sharing love and receiving love is the greatest possible thing. And love requires the greatest possible freedom. So you think all the greatest things in life, friendship and marriage, or even just going out and enjoying nature, they don't involve, like, you have to do this. And it's not even like you're making yourself do this. That's not ideal, even though sometimes we have to do that to kind of like make, to stir yourself up to do the right thing. But to will the good of the other and to receive the love of another person freely, that's what it's all about. And marriage, for example, or friendship, it's not forced. It requires a radical, self-giving freedom and a space in which to do that in order for that to work and reach its full potential. And again, this isn't a proof, but I just wanted to mention this because I think it's worth considering in this discussion. Why permit suffering? Well, if God's this unchanging, unfeeling thing, and again, that's misleading. If he's this unchanging, unfeeling thing that's kind of remote and doesn't suffer, then why is any of this? Why do any of this? Why cause any of this? Permit any of this? Is he concerned? Does he care about human suffering in any capacity and sympathize? If Jesus is God in person, again, not that he has a body by nature, but if who Jesus is God in person, then God experienced all individual lived human suffering intensively all at once in his human nature on the cross. In other words, in that suffering, if what he was saying about himself was correct, then all the suffering that anyone has ever suffered has touched him and he has taken on to himself in person. I think that's just a consideration worth considering in this discussion. And so finally, somebody said, well, even despite all that, it's not worth it. And I have felt that. I think everybody has been in that place, and some far more in far more intense suffering than others, unimaginable suffering. And yet, we're still here. So functionally, we're acting and living as if our life has meaning, and that the truth that we're pursuing, and the understanding of reality and the actions that we're doing are for something. They're for some reason. They have some sort of meaning. And so, given all of that, I think it is reasonable and good to continue to go toward the possibility that there may actually be something in reality, or a personal, infinite source of truth and goodness that corresponds to and would fulfill our deepest longing for truth and goodness and personal love. Thank you for watching, and take care.